the Piazza del Campo in Siena, Italy, July. The heat is extraordinary. 50,000 people packed so tightly into the medieval square that you cannot raise your arms. They have been here since morning. Some of them have been coming here since childhood. Their grandparents came. Their grandparents' grandparents came. The race lasts 90 seconds. 90 seconds of horses and chaos and noise so dense it becomes physical. You don't hear it. You feel it in your chest. But the race is not the point. The point is that every person in that square knows exactly who they are. They belong to one of Siena's 17 neighbourhoods, the Contrade. Their neighbourhood has a name, a symbol, a colour, a church, a patron saint, a fountain where they were baptised as infants. When their horse wins, grown men weep. When their horse loses, the grief is genuine, not performed, genuine. The palio has been run continuously since 1644, through plague, through war, through 2 world wars. The city kept running the race, not because anyone ordered them to, but because stopping would have meant losing something they understood at some level below language that they could not afford to lose. When did you last feel that? When did you last belong to something so completely that your body knew it? That winning or losing meant something not just to your mind, but to your chest, your throat, your hands. Most people watching this cannot answer that question, and that silence is what this video is about. We were not built for the lives we're living. This is not a moral judgment, it is a biological fact. For roughly 300,000 years, the overwhelming majority of human existence, Homo sapiens lived in small nomadic bands of between 20 and 50 people, not cities, not neighbourhoods of strangers who nod at each other in corridors. Bands, groups so small that every person in them knew every other person completely, their history, their humour, their particular way of carrying grief. In those bands, belonging was not a feeling, it was a survival mechanism. Exile from the group meant death. The brain learned this. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the human nervous system wired itself around the presence of known others, around the specific neurochemical reality of being recognized, being needed, being part of something that would notice your absence. The evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar spent decades studying the relationship between brain size and social group size across species. What he found was precise and uncomfortable. The human neocortex is calibrated for a maximum of approximately 150 stable relationships. 150 people you can genuinely know. Beyond that, the social machinery begins to fail. You can recognize faces. You cannot know people. 150. The city of London has 9 million inhabitants. Tokyo has 14 million. We have built a world of billions and wired our social lives for intimate contact with dozens, and then wonder why the math produces something that feels, most of the time, like hunger. But Dunbar's number alone does not explain why the bands held together as well as they did. Something else was happening around those fires. Something the brain was not simply receiving but actively producing. Every human culture ever studied, without exception, developed shared ritual as its primary technology for social bonding. Not law, not economy, not governance, ritual. Picture the Holi festival in India. A morning in March, and the streets of Mathura fill with colour, strangers covering each other in powder, the social distinctions of the rest of the year dissolved for a few hours into something that looks, from the outside, like pure joy. Or the Dia de los Muertos in Oaxaca, where families gather at the graves of their dead and bring them food and marigolds and music, the boundary between the living and the dead made permeable for one night every year, the community enlarged to include everyone who has ever belonged to it. Or the lantern festivals of East Asia, where thousands of lights are released simultaneously into a dark sky, as a single shared gesture, towards something larger than any individual life. These are not entertainment. They are not tourism. Dunbar's research shows that synchronized physical activity, moving together, breathing together, making sound together, releases endorphins in ways that isolated activity does not. The neurochemistry of belonging is produced by synchrony, by doing the same thing at the same time with people you know, by being for a moment one body rather than many. The ritual was the medicine. Every civilization understood this without knowing the neuroscience. The medieval parish church was, among other things, a ritual machine built at the centre of every European village for 1,000 years. Every week the same gathering, every year the same cycle of feast days and fast days, of planting and harvest, of birth and death and the promise of resurrection. The same stories told in the same building by the same community, generation after generation. The church was not simply where you worshipped. It was where you existed as a known person, where your name was spoken aloud, where your suffering was witnessed, and your joy was shared, and your death was mourned by people who would carry your memory forward into a world you would not live to see. Whether or not you believed the theology, the structure was doing something essential. It was giving you a story to live inside, a narrative that told you who you were, why you were here, what you owed the people around you, and what happened after you died. That structure did not disappear gradually. It was knocked down. Manchester, England, 1842. A man named James Leach publishes a description of the workers in the city's cotton mills. He describes families who have come from villages in Yorkshire and Lancashire, people whose grandparents knew every field, every face, every story of the land they worked. Now they live in rows of back-to-back terraces, 6 to a room, the air black with soot, the streets full of people they will never speak to. They work 14 hours a day. On Sundays they have nowhere to go. The church that gave their week its shape is 30 miles away and they will never see it again. Leach is not writing about alienation. He does not have that word yet. He is simply describing what he sees. But what he sees is the template for everything that follows. The sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies watched this transformation and named what was being lost. Gemeinschaft, community, organised around intimate personal bonds, shared history and mutual obligation. Replaced by Gesellschaft, society, organised around impersonal contracts, economic exchange, and the management of strangers. The wound opened here, not in the smartphone era, not in the 1960s, in the mill towns of northern England and the industrial suburbs of Paris and the tenement blocks of Chicago. The loneliness epidemic did not begin with social media. Social media arrived into a wound that had been open for 200 years. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes not from being without people, but from being without witnesses, from moving through a world in which no one knows your name well enough to notice when you stop using it. The band around the fire knew your name, the parish knew your name, the contrada knew your name. It baptized you at its fountain, and it will bury you in its cemetery, and in between it will know, in the granular, irreplaceable way that only proximity across years can produce, exactly what your life cost you. We have traded that for something faster. We're not sure, most of us, what we got in return. The Korean-German philosopher Byung-Chul Han has spent his career mapping the interior of that trade. Han argues that the modern individual is not oppressed by an external authority, a ruler, a church, a state that tells them what to do and what to feel. They have been liberated from all of that. They are free, and the freedom has made them their own oppressor. The performance society demands constant production, constant achievement, constant display of the results of your optimization for an audience that never stops watching. On social media, the transparency society Han calls it, everything must be visible, Everything must be shareable. Everything must perform. The self becomes a product. And the tragedy of the product self is that it cannot encounter another person. It can only broadcast at them. Genuine encounter, the kind that changes you, that requires you to be unknown for long enough to be discovered, is incompatible with the performance of the self. You cannot be truly known by someone you are performing for. A Saturday night, 20 years ago. A group of friends around a table, no phones, the conversation going wherever it goes, someone saying something they didn't plan to say, someone else surprised by their own response. That is encounter. That is the thing the performance society makes structurally difficult, not because people are worse than they used to be, but because the architecture of modern attention leaves almost no room for the unoptimized moment. John Cacioppo, a neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, spent 30 years measuring what social isolation does to the human body. His findings were not what anyone expected. Chronic loneliness is as damaging to long-term health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It activates the same neural threat detection systems as physical pain, because for 300,000 years being cut off from the group was a physical threat. The brain has not updated its threat model to account for cities, but the finding that mattered most was this. Chronic loneliness does not stay static. It rewires the brain. Prolonged isolation restructures the social circuitry in ways that make connection progressively harder, increasing vigilance towards social threat, narrowing the bandwidth available for trust, teaching the brain to expect rejection, and therefore to find it, even where it does not exist. Loneliness makes you lonelier. The trap tightens from the inside. A child who grows up primarily in digital interaction, whose social cognition develops through screens rather than through the 1,000 hours of face-to-face negotiation, physical presence, and unmediated emotional contact that the brain requires, does not simply miss out on something nice. They develop differently. The social circuitry that should be built through childhood encounter is built instead around a substitute that cannot provide what the original offered, and some of what is missed in those years cannot be recovered later. This is not a cultural concern. It is a developmental one. There is a philosopher at the University of Toronto named John Vervaeke, who has spent years trying to name something that most people feel but cannot articulate. He calls it the meaning crisis, not the loneliness epidemic, though the two are related, not the mental health crisis, though it produces one. The meaning crisis is what happens when the frameworks that once made community intelligible collapse, and nothing replaces them. For most of human history, meaning was not a personal project. It was a shared inheritance, delivered through religion, through ritual, through story, through the felt sense that the people around you were participating in the same, larger narrative that you were. The man weeping in the Piazza del Campo when his horse wins the Palio is not weeping because he has a strong social network. He is weeping because he is inside a story, a specific, ancient, particular story that tells him who he is, where he came from, and what he belongs to. The story gives the community its weight. Remove the story, and you are left with proximity without meaning. People near each other, but not together in the way that matters. What modernity took was not only the people, it took the story. And without the story, the community has nothing to organize itself around except convenience, which is not enough to hold human beings together when things get hard. You cannot rebuild genuine community by building community centers. You cannot solve a narrative crisis with a social policy. What is needed is harder than that, and more personal than that, and cannot be delivered from outside. It requires each person to ask, in whatever quiet they can find, what story they are actually living inside, not the story they perform for others, the one that actually holds them, the one that would make genuine commitment to other people feel not like a burden, but like the point. Most people, when they sit with that question honestly, find the answer less clear than they expected. That uncertainty is not a failure. It is the beginning of the right kind of attention. Somewhere in your own life, there is probably a version of this absence, a gathering you stopped attending, a community you drifted from, a moment when you chose the performance of connection over the risk of the real thing. What story were you inside when you felt most fully yourself, and what would it take, not as a concept but as a specific choice this week, to find your way back toward it? If this kind of question matters to you, stay with this channel. There is more to follow.